Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm joined today by the wonderful Mychailo Wynnyckyj from Kyiv, Ukraine. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for taking time to join with me. I'll introduce you a little bit, but then I'd love you to tell people more about yourself as well. So you're originally from Canada, but you're Ukrainian, obviously by roots, and you've been living there for many years. You're a professor of sociology at Ukraine Business School.
No, it's, the university is called Kyiv Mychailo Academy.
Okay. And you studied in Cambridge in the UK as well as in Canada. So you've been an international person. You even lived in Melbourne, Australia for some time as a child. So you've had I would say a good intro to the outside world. And now you've been happily living in Kyiv for some time. You're a father of 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, if that's correct from your wonderful family photos that I've seen. And you also write daily for the Kyiv Post, is that correct?
Well, it actually started off as being just a blog on my Facebook Facebook page called From Kyiv, and I actually started writing that in 2014, actually 2013, when we had the Maidan revolution, and then I put a pause on that for a little while, started to get involved in other things. And now, I guess as of about beginning of February, when it became pretty obvious that we're looking at another stage of the hot war, decided to write again, and then Kyiv Post picked it up as a sort of a byline. So yeah, I've been trying to do it, not necessarily daily, but trying to put a little bit of analysis into what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, how I became aware of your writing, have a lot of Ukrainian friends, having worked there for a few years myself, and a good friend of mine shared one of your posts. I think it was day 2 or day 3 of the war, which I read and I started sharing as well. So obviously my goal in Australia is to help people understand a bit about the war, and with a lot of help from my friends around the world, we've been doing as much as we can to kind of raise funds and raise awareness. So your blog has been great for me personally, because I've been able to kind of see normal life on top of analysis of certain facts and things. And I think as an academic who's kind of lived and worked there for some time, but you're also a person who's lived abroad a lot, and you're still raising your family in the midst of a war. I've really resonated a lot with many of the things that you have said, and some of those things I wanted to talk a bit more about today. But is there anything else you'd like to say about yourself before we do that?
Just, I guess, put a number on it, because you've said a couple times that I've lived in Ukraine for some time. It's been 20 years.
Yes.
I spent I'm 51, so I spent 27 years of my life in Canada. Then 4, well, with a small break in Australia, as you mentioned, but that was in childhood. And then I then spent 4 years in England, and now 20 years has been Ukraine has been home. So we've lived through 2 revolutions and now a war. Your statement was that we were in day 2 or day 3 of the war. In actual fact, we in Ukraine say that the war started 8 years ago. We've had pauses, and we've had various things that sort of truces, ceasefires, etc., sort of low level, high level, etc. But this is obviously the hot part of the war. So I think when you said day 3, it's probably as of sort of the end of February when we've heated up again. But this is ongoing, and this has been it's been to some extent stressful, but at the same time I wouldn't want to be living anywhere else, because I think it's probably one of the most fascinating and interesting and perhaps fulfilling places in the world to live at this point, which may of course sound very strange to people that are not in Ukraine at the moment, but that usually is the way things are. In the revolution, the safest place to be was in the middle of things. When you're in a war zone, the safest place to be, strangely enough, or it feels the safest, is to be as close as possible to the fighting. And we're about at the moment, we're at our cottage, our summer home, and have been here for the last 2 months. The closest explosions are about 35-40 kilometers away, but we regularly see jets and rockets and helicopters flying overhead. Thankfully, nothing flying out of them on our heads, but nevertheless, we're pretty close.
which is not that far, really, as the crow flies. So my heart is, I visualize that very clearly. And thank you for the point about 2014, because when I worked in Ukraine, it was in the heydays of 2010 to 2012, when the whole of Europe's eyes were watching the football where Spain defeated Italy. I was there cheering Spain on. It was a great moment after 2.5 years of very hard work. And that was really when I got to know Ukraine. You know, I spent time in Donetsk and Kyiv and Lviv. I traveled to many cities. I got to know people in all of those places. So for me, when and I'm going to call it an invasion, happened in 2014, and those areas were annexed and people were killed, and lots of refugees fled Donetsk to come to live in places like Kyiv, and the airplane was shot down and Australians were killed. For me, that was a very big missed opportunity in terms of the world's response to Putin then. I'm still angry that he got away with it. I have been talking about that a lot to anyone that will listen here and in many other places for the last, well, it's coming up to a decade, 8 years. So I really do, you know, I'm aligned with you on that for sure.
You mentioned that my background is in sociology. That's true, but in addition to teaching sort of undergraduates and graduates in sociology, I also do quite a bit of work in as a management consultant, organizational behavior, and I teach in various business schools, including Ukrainian Catholic University and Kyiv Mychailo Academy. The point is that I used to travel a lot into Donetsk and Kramatorsk and Mykolaiv, of course, as well, Kherson, Kakhovka, Mariupol. These are all places where some very, very good people live, and some very interesting businesses used to be very vibrant in that area. Donetsk has always had a sort of an industrial kind of culture to it, and that created a very interesting organizational kind of culture as well. Mariupol, of course, was very industrial and also a port city, which made it very an interesting place. And unfortunately, both of those cities, I mean, if you remember 2012 and the football final, the Donetsk stadium is no more.
Yes.
And the airport, of course, was completely destroyed in 2014. It's one of the places that Ukrainians consider to be sort of these I don't know. It's a symbol of resistance to because the airport was a place where Ukrainian soldiers actually held out for almost a year, having been completely surrounded. So the idea of being completely surrounded and holding out for a very long time is something that's very deeply ingrained in the Ukrainian military ethic. We're seeing it again in Mariupol, where the city has been 90% destroyed. We've got a massive humanitarian catastrophe. Today, I'm just watching the estimates are that we could have up to 50,000 dead out of a city of 500,000. Most of those obviously being civilians. The Russians are behaving in the way that the Russian soldiers tend to behave in wars. In other words, it's a scorched earth tactic. Nothing is left standing. The Ukrainians are being very valiant in terms of their of our ability to defend ourselves. I'm really hoping for some counterattacks to come soon, and this war is not going to end anytime soon. So we very much appreciate what you're doing and any help that we can get internationally. Thankfully, the help has started to come. That's good, but keep it coming.
Well, it's 3 months too late, in my opinion. Well, probably 8 years too late, in my opinion, but definitely 3 months too late, in my opinion. I helped some of my friends escape from Kharkiv. We took care of them when they arrived in Poland. I've helped friends in Kyiv who've escaped to Poland, as well as I've also helped send medicines into Kherson for surgeons, as well as individuals who I know who are living there who don't have heart medication for their parents and so on and so forth. So, you know, what you say is resonating deeply with me, and the death toll is frightening and shocking and is sickening, very, very sickening for a lot of people.
Well, I mean, look, after Bucha and Irpin and Borodyanka and the cities around, or the towns around Kyiv to the northwest of Kyiv, after that became public, I think that many of us in the world have realized that Putin is very serious about what he's saying. And I'm very grateful that finally we're starting to see even very pro-Russian analysts in the world who are constantly talking about the fact that this war is about NATO membership, or it's about economic interests, or it's about geopolitical spheres of influence, etc. It's not about that at all. It's about destroying Ukrainians. This is a genocidal war. We've seen this 80 years ago in another genocidal war that was about killing. That one of the issues was about killing and completely wiping out a particular ethnic religious group called the Jews of Europe. Now it's about wiping out Ukrainians and making sure that Ukrainians are never going to be a separate nation from Russians, and that means wiping out a significant portion of their population, of our population. And Putin's very open about that. I mean, we've had publications in official state agents or state websites in the Russian Federation. He's been talking for ages about the fact that, you know, he's got some sort of delusional concept of history whereby Ukrainians and Russians are actually one people, and that the fact that Ukrainians want to be independent is a CIA plot or Austro-Hungarian, you know, concept that came up 100 years ago or something like that. In other words, he's creating some sort of a narrative that really doesn't make any sense except to justify the mass killing of Ukrainians, and that's what this war, unfortunately, at this point is all about. I don't see it ending soon. I'm very grateful to the fact that I think that the West and the world, the international community, has realized that this is in fact the intention of Putin, and that he needs to be stopped.
And what when you say you see help coming, what do you see coming? What have you noticed in the last days?
Well,
other than Blinken's visit.
Well, in addition to look, I mean, we can be you know, facetious and skeptical of politicians coming to Ukraine, but the reality is that each time that they do come, and I'll quote Zelensky at this point, each time we have guests, they don't come empty-handed. In other words, it's no longer about humanitarian aid, although humanitarian aid is extremely important and we're very grateful for it. It's about weapons, and it's about weapons, and more weapons. It's about heavy weapons, light weapons, air weapons, all kinds of weapons. I mean, you don't win a war with blankets. It's as simple as that. You don't win a war with bandages. You help people to survive, and that's great. But at the end of the day, we have a war to win, and that means we need weapons. We've got some very, very motivated people. I spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of months. We have this sort of periodic nightly vigils or nightly, I guess, rotations that we call it in the territorial brigades here in the area that I'm in. The local, you know, the local villagers, if you like, I'm calling them villagers because generally they're not very well educated. They tend to be you know, sort of farmers or manual workers, and none of them have any kind of even inkling of tolerating any kind of Russian yoke or Russian occupation. These people will kill Russians with their bare hands if it comes to that, and I mean, we've seen scenes of tanks being stopped literally by unarmed civilians. Ukrainians want to be independent. Ukrainians want freedom. This is what this war is about. It's about freedom and independence. It's about the ability to exist. And unfortunately, those values, and they may sound like very sort of, you know, I guess, very idealistic kind of concepts. You know, we talk about freedom, liberty. These are things that are supposed to be put on statues. But sometimes we need to fight for them, particularly when they are being, you know, when the country is being existentially attacked. So yeah, it's about weapons. And what have I seen? I've seen new planes. I've seen new helicopters. I've seen my friends. I mean, I'm unfortunately in no shape to go fight myself. So I try to do what I can by doing interviews and my writing. But I have very close friends that are, well, at the moment, on the front. One of them has a birthday today, 42. He posted that he would not be doing much celebrating today because he's got a lot of orcs to kill. It doesn't sound particularly humanitarian and that sort of thing, but at the end of the day, he's bragging about the fact that he's got new weapons and new abilities to actually defend himself, defend his country, defend his family, defend his friends. That's what this is all about, and it's coming. I've been saying for 2 months, Ukrainians will win this war. We are winning. It's taking a very long time because, as you said, 3 months too late. We don't have the proper weaponry, but we've got a hell of a lot of motivated people that want to live and want to be free.
Thank you for sharing that. How do you feel when you see Ethiopian men queuing up outside the Russian embassy to go and fight a war in Ukraine? How does that make you feel?
You know, I feel sorry for them. At the end of the day, I feel sorry for them for 2 reasons. They are, the reason that they're queuing up is because they're poor and they are being offered, I don't know what it is. It's something like $500 a month, maybe $1,000 a month to go fight. And then they'll show up on the battlefield. And because of the fact that their motivation is material rather than ideal, they'll get killed. Because they're not going to be motivated, and they will not will not be effective against people that, you know, I've got a friend of mine who unfortunately did not survive, who continued to shoot from his rifle and took out an additional 4 soldiers that were attacking him, even though he had shrapnel in his leg, he had a bullet in his shoulder, and half his liver was hanging out of his stomach, and he continued to fight. That kind of motivation is something that that you don't counter with mercenaries that are looking for $1,000 a month. And unfortunately, what we've seen is an extremely high death toll. And it's often very difficult not to, you know, to feel sorry for people that are throwing themselves into battle. But the reality is that people in war die, and the Russian side, which now includes a lot of mercenaries as well from poor countries, has an amazingly large number of casualties. The figures are upwards of 20,000 dead and upwards of 70 to 80,000 wounded and missing in action. I mean, that's just, those kinds of numbers are catastrophic. And people continue to come.
Well, I feel the international community has a responsibility to stop those planes from taking off with those men on board as well, personally, but that might be a whole other interview. So I wanted to ask you, you know, what do you feel is your responsibility to your country and to your students, because you still continue to teach and hold online classes, and also you're still being a dad day to day, as well as going out at the night and doing patrols. So how much responsibility are you holding personally on your shoulders at this moment?
Well, let's put it this way. I'm not holding any more responsibility than any other Ukrainian, and I'm not holding any more responsibility, certainly, than the guys that are actually in the, you know, the guys that are doing the fighting. I think each of us is doing our part. We've got, we 2 weeks ago restarted classes. Obviously, my students are very much sort of scattered around. Out of the 26 or 27 students that are signed up for my course, actually 28 students signed up for my course, 6 are actually engaged in the armed forces. So they're obviously on pause, and their studies are on pause. 22 out of the 22 that are left, I think I've got 8 that are out of country, still hooking up out of places like, in other words, signing in from Germany, from Poland, from Czech Republic. One is actually in the UK. Most of them are female. The ones that have left, because we've had from I think the second day of the war, if I'm not mistaken, from February 26th, it is problematic if you are a male aged 18 to 60 to leave the country. And that actually makes some sense, because obviously somebody has to defend, and there's a lot of work to be done, including, like we said, nightly patrols and checkpoints, etc. Not everybody has to be involved directly in fighting. But there's work to be done to keep the country whole and working. My kids started school again 2 weeks ago as well, obviously online. They're in classes at the moment. I point upwards because I'm in the basement. This is our sort of bomb shelter that we have, that we come down into when there's an air raid siren. Thankfully, no air raid sirens at the moment, and they're in the middle of classes. Their teachers are also scattered. A couple are in Kyiv still, because they had no place to go. Others are in smaller towns across Ukraine. But I think that that's a very good thing, that we're trying to make sure that life goes on. And as traumatic as things are, and obviously they are extremely traumatic, the one way that we can show our resistance is by making sure that life goes on. And that means that when I was in Kyiv last week, for example, we drove in for a couple of errands and that sort of thing. Cafes were starting to work. Restaurants are starting to work. Certainly the government is working. We've got, the economy is restarting as much as it can. Now, that means that there's still periodic air raid sirens. People still will go down into the subway, they'll go down into basements, whatever, will take shelter. The air raids will last 15-20 minutes, or the warnings will last 15-20 minutes. Usually, lately, again, your question about help, we've had an awful lot more successes with anti-aircraft fire. In other words, most of the sirens go off and we hear explosions somewhere around Kyiv, somewhere around the major cities. The anti-aircraft fire does shoot down the missiles, shoot down the rockets, and we get back to going about our business. It's not yet the level of defense that we would like, because certain rockets do get through, particularly in areas where the anti-aircraft systems are not as well entrenched and working. But certainly in the capital and the areas, we're starting to get back to some level of normality and cleanup.
Well, I've been helping a lot of refugee women and children who've made their way to Poland, and some women, particularly with the onset of summer in Europe, when Europeans would be starting to think about their holidays, many women and children will now find themselves homeless again when hotels and places like that start asking them to leave. So a lot of them are considering coming back home. I personally feel it's too soon for that, and I'd love to find ways to prevent that from having to happen. But are you noticing more people coming back home?
Yeah, we are noticing that. Certainly Kyiv, the city, is becoming repopulated over the last couple of weeks, and that's very important. The statistics on the border are now, and have been for the last week, we have more people coming in than going out. And that's something that's changed radically since, I guess, the main exit at the beginning of March. So yeah, people are returning. Now, is it completely safe? No, it's a new reality of a low level war in Kyiv and the areas of Western Ukraine, and a very hot war in the south and in the east. So certainly, I think that the resistance has come to a point where the Russians simply don't have enough missiles to be able to terrorize the capital and the West as much as they would like, but periodically they try to. They're focusing at the moment on logistical targets, specifically on the railway. So railway stations are definitely a dangerous place to be, and anything close to a railway junction is certainly a dangerous place to be. But they've shifted their strategy, and they're no longer interested in creating terror throughout the cities of the east and, or excuse me, of the center and west. They're now being a little bit more selective in their targeting. Now, that's not true for places like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Dnipro, Kryvyi Rih. Those are frontline cities that unfortunately are being targeted to the same extent as Mariupol. In other words, we're going to see very, very serious destruction in those areas in the next couple of weeks, unless we can get some serious counterattacking happening. The key is going to be to survive to the middle of May. As we know, May 9th is a sort of a sacred holiday in Eastern Europe, specifically in Russia. For Putin, it's kind of a fetish. It's May 9th was traditionally for the last 80 years celebrated in Russia as Victory Day, victory in the Second World War. And that means military parades, and that means all kinds of various rituals, etc., that are very militaristic. And certainly Putin is hoping for some sort of successes by May 9th. And I think that it'll probably, I'm certainly looking at the middle of May as being a kind of a turning point period where we know where this war is going to be going. He needs to have made some gains or basically failed completely by the middle of May. And then at that point, we'll be able to see whether it's really safe to come back or not. It is getting safer, and I think that that's very important to restart the economy, to restart the country. Again, that's our way of resisting. To be just to live means to resist, and we have a responsibility to live because we have had so many people that have sacrificed their lives for the sake of us being able to live.
Yes, you're right. But I guess every now and then a rocket or a missile lands on Lviv, or a place that has been deemed relatively safe. Do you think a lot of that strategy is just to cause panic in those areas and to let the nation know that he can attack wherever he wants?
Sure, probably that's the terror tactic. But I think that the last attack on Lviv was in fact a logistical attack. In other words, he was actually targeting. They were actually targeting the train lines and train junctions, railway junctions. So I think that that's kind of strategic shift has happened, and it's no longer, for the time being anyway, no longer about terrorizing people. However, having said that, and I've written a lot about this, my last article in Kyiv Post was about this, that there is a danger, and that is if Putin starts to feel that he's losing, there is a military doctrine that is used and published by the Russians, and it's called escalate to de-escalate. In other words, the way out if you start to lose is a nuke. And throwing a tactical nuclear weapon at a Ukrainian city is still a very viable possibility. At that point, there will be a response, obviously, from the nuclear powers of the West. And at that point, the war could finish quite quickly. Or his blackmail might work, because obviously he's going to blackmail the world. The world, at that point, it's going to be, he'll throw a tactical nuclear weapon at a Ukrainian city, and he'll turn around and he'll say, if you don't stop supporting Ukraine, the next one will be on a European city. And it's at that point, the principled position of the West becomes very important. If we fall for that kind of blackmail, and that's so that we understand he's a terrorist, so he blackmails. If we fall for that, then the war will continue. And the next one after Ukraine will be Poland or a NATO country in the Baltics, etc. If we stand firm and in fact say, look, you've thrown a nuclear weapon and here is a response, and it must be a more active response. I'm not necessarily saying it has to be nuclear, but it has to be a much more active response. Then the bully, and Putin is a bully, will finally feel that he's been stopped. And at that point, there will probably be an internal Russian crisis, be it a coup, be it some sort of in other words, it is a hard response from our friends in NATO and in the international community in general, is something that could save lives. And the strange thing about wars is that sometimes when you're robust in your response, in your military response, what you are in fact doing is saving lives rather than escalating. Now, Putin is going to escalate. The question is, at that point, what's the response going to be? The Ukrainians can defend themselves for so long. At some point in time, there has to be a counterattack. And I think that it was very, very correct, unscripted, when Biden in Poland said, this man cannot remain in power. He can't. And Russia is a permanent existential threat now, not just to Ukraine, but to the world. And unless we do something about it, and Ukrainians can't do something about it on their own, it's not enough to just give us weapons. I mean, we can stop it, we can delay it, we can fight for our own country, but we cannot save the world. The world has to save itself. I think that's what I'm kind of messaging, is that we need a more robust response.
Do you think that's what Blinken was discussing with Zelensky yesterday or Sunday?
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that meeting, but I think it wasn't just Blinken; it was also Austin. I think it was very symbolic that we had both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense arrive in Kyiv together, and I think that was extremely important. And if you looked at the official video of the greeting, there was a lot to be said for body language. Particularly with Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Reznikov, and with our Chief of Staff, General Zaluzhny. Reznikov has known Mr. Austin, Defense Secretary Austin, for many, many months, and they obviously are very good friends. And this was a greeting it was a kind of a joking greeting from Secretary Austin, which I think was very, very symbolic. And the body language when he was introduced to General Zaluzhny, who is considered by many Ukrainians as being basically a military genius, because what he's been able to do over the last 2 months with an army that is 1/5 the size of the Russians has been just absolutely amazing. I got the impression
he always looks so happy and jovial in his photos. He's always smiling. He's so cute.
Jovial. Secretary Austin, I got the impression, stood at attention in front of General Zaluzhny. The level of respect was, again, body language says an awful lot. We're very hopeful after that meeting. President Zelensky has been fantastic in his speeches to multiple parliaments. I wasn't a big fan of Zelensky prior to February 24th, but I have to give him his due now. And obviously, from the meeting of Blinken and Austin, we saw that so much has been happening behind the scenes. And Ukraine's ambassador to the US, Oksana Markarova, who's a dear friend of mine, she's done such a fantastic job. Generally, the world, the international community has come to Ukraine's help, and that is very much appreciated. But that is not something that has happened spontaneously. The Ukrainians have also done a fantastic job of mobilizing the international community. And I think that we've been very lucky with this kind of leadership in this case.
Yeah, I certainly see that. I'm watching him address different parliaments. I watched when he addressed the Australian Parliament, he asked exactly for what he needed. He got some of what he needed. I also watch a lot of interviews that Poroshenko gives out in the field, and he likes to take a lot of credit for building the Ukrainian army after 2014. How important is he right now, you think, in terms of what he's doing?
I honestly, I'm not really following Poroshenko too much. I think that I think that he did some very good things in 2014, 15, 16 in his first 2.5 years in office. I think after that, there were some serious problems. And as a result of that, he lost the election. I do want to say one thing, and that is that we recently had an appointment of a new Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Miroshnichenko, whom I happen to know for many, many years. He's a colleague of mine from a friend, I guess, a comrade from the days of the revolution on the Maidan. I think that Ukraine is very lucky to have those types of people appointed in key positions. And if Vasyl is watching this, hello, and to our Australian friends, I think you've got. I think Ukraine has a very good voice in Australia today, and I think that that's something very, very important.
Absolutely. Well, I wrote to 13 MPs on International Women's Day asking for as much help as possible. And so I was, started to see some responses to that reasonably quickly. Some didn't know how to respond, but I was happy to see that the address in Parliament got some results quite quickly. So you can share this interview with the Ukrainian ambassador, definitely. It was interesting the way you speak about online learning, because it puts COVID lockdown online learning into a whole new level, doesn't it? And I guess you got together with your colleagues to decide, right, do we do this or not do this?
Yeah, I think that I've been in education, involved in educational reform for the last 12, I guess 14 years in Ukraine as well. And COVID has certainly been a global crisis for education, and it's made us rethink the university, made us rethink how classrooms work in schools. Up until 2 years ago, we need to understand that online learning was a sort of a little addition that we had as a sort of I guess, icing on the cake for those that really wanted to sort of take additional courses. Now it's become part of our lives. And I think that, in fact, as strange as this may sound, COVID was a blessing for Ukraine, certainly for the educational sphere, because we were not ready for online distance learning 2 years ago. We got ready. Suddenly, we have a war that is encapsulating the entire country, not just a particular region in the east, and life goes on because we have the ability to keep in touch. We have the ability to keep teaching. We have the ability to keep some sort of contact going between teacher and student. Now, it obviously makes things a lot more difficult in terms of motivation. There are certain things that are impossible to do online. We can talk about having discussions online, etc., but in reality, online tends to be much more of a lecture format, and sort of primarily a one-way presentation. And I think that we really need to have the classroom learning. We need to either find a substitute or return to the classroom. But online is here to stay, and I think that Ukrainians, in fact, at this point, now that COVID is sort of, I guess, worldwide kind of dying down a little bit, or at least we hope it is, Ukrainians are going to be a little bit at the forefront, because our educational system is probably going to remain in a much more online format for the foreseeable future. We are very conscious of the fact that we need to maintain that, because we have a danger of brain drain. And to be, with all due respect for what you're doing, for example, with refugees in Poland, I think it's extremely important. But we have a danger, and that is that people don't return. And if people don't return, we're going to have not a country of 43 million as we had at the start of the war. We're going to have a much smaller country, and that obviously, serves Putin's purpose, because if the goal was to make sure that Ukrainians as a country and as a people don't exist, then what better way to do them than to scatter them throughout the world? I'm someone that is a child of refugee children. My parents fled Western Ukraine during the Second World War as children. So I was born in Canada, and I know what it's like to be a child of a refugee. And it's a lot of work to maintain your identity. Not everybody does it. Not everybody is, there's a certain level of assimilation that happens. So the reason I talk about this is because I think that the online educational sphere is one of the areas how we will maintain a contact in the community in the short term, and certainly in the medium term and in the long term for those that stay outside of Ukraine. We must maintain that contact, and think about how we're going to mix that with an offline component. So once peace arrives, not everybody's going to come back, but we need to have a program of bringing people into the country to see both the horrors and the beauty. And I think that I'm gonna end this little speech with a bit of a positive twist, and that is to say that when the peace comes, I'm really hoping for a massive numbers of tourists, including from Australia. First of all, we need your money. Secondly, that was a joke. But secondly, there are certain things that are worth seeing here. Not just the ravages of war, but also the beauty of an absolutely unique and fascinating country.
Well, I have been a tourist advocate for Ukraine for many years, so you don't have to convert me. I will be coming back. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to share some good news with you in terms of learning. With the help of some friends, we established a kindergarten for Ukrainian children. So it's a funded kindergarten with lessons provided by Polish Ukrainian teachers. So kids can come and have some time away from mums, which is also important for those women. And, to still be learning, everyday classroom stuff. That's in Gdansk in northern Poland. In Krakow, we've established a community and cultural center. So over the Easter weekend, we held a lot of activities for children to come and do arts and crafts. We had an Easter party. They did games and loads of things. We're now doing book readings on a weekly basis, Ukrainian books as well as English books. I'm going to read my children's books to the kids this weekend in Krakow. So as many things that can be done as possible, because we really want those children to have an opportunity to put war aside out of their little brains for a while, to engage in culture, to engage in learning, to engage in laughter, and to engage in fun, and to feel special. And, as much as we can do to kind of keep building that up for children, the better, because from my point of view, you can't take away the trauma immediately. You can't take away, you can't unsee the things you've seen. Your well-being will be forever affected. So how can we start to alleviate some of that suffering now? Because, the intergenerational trauma that will result as talk about the child of a refugee, we're seeing it everywhere, and it's shocking and frightening, and it's really important to talk about that.
Chrissy, I want to thank you very much for. This is perhaps presumptuous of me of saying that I'm thanking you from all Ukrainians, but certainly for me personally as a Ukrainian, and as a Ukrainian man who is concerned about children and women that have had to leave the country. It's very much appreciated what you're doing. I also appreciate the fact that people are listening to this and watching. That means that you're interested in helping in whatever way you can. Be it through pressure on your governments to continue to provide aid to Ukraine in our fight for existence and for freedom, and also in the humanitarian cause for the people of Ukraine, which I think is probably the most important. For those that might be interested, if you don't mind, Chrissy, I'll do a little plug here. For those that are interested in a little bit of context, I did actually publish a book in 2019 called Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, and I think you're probably reaching for it, if I'm not mistaken, which is great. If I had the ability to sign it through Zoom, I probably would be doing that right now, but I can't. So Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle and analysis of the Revolution of Dignity. It's really about the events of 2014 up until 2018. You asked about Poroshenko. There's a lot about that period there. It's obviously, I'll be honest with you, I'm working on the next one because we need to have more Ukrainian voices heard throughout the world. And I think that many of the things that have happened over the last couple of months need to be told. But for those that are interested in the context, there's that as well, and it's available on Amazon if anyone's interested in that.
Thank you. I'm going to put this video, our interview, onto YouTube, and I'll post the links to your book in the notes so people can find it easily.
Thank you.
And you, in one of your blog posts, you talked about taking your dog to the vet. Now, here is another side funny story for you. It's not funny, it's sad, but we can try to smile a little. I have a lot of friends here who are interested in animal welfare. And so they were very concerned about the pets, and all over the news and the media, we see Ukrainian pets waiting for their owners, looking for their owners. So in your blog post, you talked about taking your pet to the vet in Podol in Kyiv, which is a very, very beautiful part of Kyiv, a special place in my heart. And I visualized your journey that day and taking your dog to the vet. My friend's birthday was on last week. She turned 60, and her birthday present was a donation to the animal charity of Ukraine. So all over the world, people are also loving the passion of Ukrainian pets. So I hope that also makes you feel good.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Tasya unfortunately had a tick bite, and for those of us that are, she's a Labrador Retriever, and she's for those of us that know a little bit about tick bites, they can be fatal, and so we rushed her into to a vet. I consider this man a saint, because he actually was in a place called Brovary, which was under continuous artillery attack in the east of Kyiv. He evacuated his parents from a small town or a small village outside of Brovary, basically through artillery, and his own dog unfortunately did not survive. He had a spaniel that was 9.5 years old, and she basically died of shock, effectively under artillery. And yet the next day after that, he was treating ours, and he was treating our lab, and Tasya has. It sounds strange that, you know, when human lives are at stake, you would be worried about dogs' lives. But the reality is that she's part of our family, and she was very, very ill. So we had 3 days of intravenous treatment, 2 days actually at the vet clinic. And that was a fascinating experience because the artillery was getting pretty close at that point. We were certainly hearing it. It was about 12 kilometers away, both ours and theirs. So yeah, and here we were in a vet clinic, saving the life of Tasya. And then on the last day, we actually took the intravenous bottles with us. And this particular veterinarian was the only one working at the time, and in Podil region, and he had a lineup of strays and various people that were bringing in dogs that unfortunately dogs and cats that had been abandoned by people that were leaving, saving themselves in the first place, which is of course a sad story, but war is always about making choices, and choices are not necessarily easy to make. When you need to save a human life. Probably logical, and I will certainly never hold it against these people that were leaving their pets behind. But I certainly believe that those people that stayed and that took care of their pets, that have now created shelters for them, and with help from people like your friend, are doing a fantastic job, and doing something that's very important for our communities and for our society, and I think for humanity in general. So thank you for that.
It was certainly a big decision for my friend to leave Kharkiv, because she had a cat rescue. So she had 13 cats and 3 dogs, and her do I, don't I, after a few nights in a bathtub became a do I. And, you know, she cried more about leaving her pets behind than worrying for her own safety. And I felt immensely saddened for her that she had to go through that in its totality. It's very, very frightening. So have you had crisis fatigue or compassion fatigue yourself over the last 3 months? Have you felt it?
I'm probably not very good at sort of I guess self-analysis of my psychological state. I do certainly see from my family that we're going through emotional ups and downs. Probably has to do with the fact that we're, for the last 2 months, sort of living on top of each other, with not a lot of space around. But, you know, my attitude towards it is any fatigue that I feel is incomparable to the fatigue and the wounds that are being suffered by people that are actually doing the fighting. And those are the people that are allowing me to have this conversation at the end of the day. And they're enabling me to have this conversation. And I think that each of us has a part to play in this war. And I don't feel I have either the right or the time to figure out whether or not I'm tired. It's basically to say, to be honest with you. But as someone who's responsible for 4 kids, my wife and I are definitely feeling that it is affecting them. Our youngest is responding, and not just our youngest, actually, they're all responding with this sort of wide-eyed patriotism, which is very inspiring. But they are feeling fatigue, definitely. and we are thankfully in a relatively safe place, because, like I said, we have helicopters and planes flying overhead with nothing coming out of them falling on our heads, which is certainly safer than many people around us. We've talked a lot in the family about the possibilities of leaving. We have a consensus of 110% that nobody's going anywhere. This is home, and we do not plan on leaving anywhere. Now, we have unfortunately had to evacuate our apartment, which is in the Podil region of Kyiv. So we're not there. We occasionally go into Kyiv, but we're in our summer home, which is certainly safer. We had refugees here during the first 3 weeks of the invasion. When it became obvious that this was not ending anytime soon, they decided to move on as well. So one family went to Western Ukraine. Another family has actually left the country via Romania. As I understand it, they drove to Greece, where they have family. So Ukrainians are getting scattered around the world. And, you know, it may sound a little bit presumptuous of me, but as a child of a refugee, I don't think our family wants to do that again. So this is home, and we plan to stay here as long as we can. Is there fatigue? Of course there's fatigue. We sleep sometimes nights better than others. Last night was not a good night. But yeah, it's just the way it is.
I'm very grateful for you sharing that to me. And I listened to an interview you did on Canadian broadcasts the other day, and you talked a little bit about the conversations around patriotism and rape and very difficult things like that. And as a father, it must be frightening to have those conversations with your kids.
Yeah, it is frightening. I think that, growing up in Canada, I remember, sex ed classes. And believe it or not, I actually went to a Catholic school, which made that sort of sex ed classes were kind of interesting when they were taught by a nun. But it's different when you have to introduce to your 15 and 17-year-old daughters. They experience and they see the results of Bucha. And the hatred that you see in their eyes. When yesterday, we actually had broadcast on TV an interview with a POW, a Russian prisoner, who had actually been intercepted previously. His conversation with his girlfriend had been intercepted, where his girlfriend actually told him that, hey, don't worry about it. It's okay if you rape all these Ukrainian women. They're not really women anyways. Just don't necessarily tell me about it and make sure you're protected. That is almost a direct quote from his girlfriend. What was this guy doing in Ukraine is absolutely frightening. And daughters are listening to that. And the reaction obviously is hatred, which is probably justified. And I've done a lot of soul searching myself as a believing Christian, as a Catholic, about what is forgiveness. And one of the things that my spiritual advisors have told me about is forgiveness is important, but reconciliation comes first. In other words, there needs to be repentance on the other side. If you don't repent and all you're doing is reconciling, then what you're doing is you are demeaning the victim. So we're waiting for some repentance from that side. It's also very difficult to be a father in an environment where rape and murder are something that are pretty well commonplace. Thankfully not witnessed by us, but pretty nearby. And it takes a lot to convince your daughters that not all men are evil. And that this is, that may sound dehumanizing, but that these men that are raping, and we've had an incident which is just absolutely just atrocious. We had a guy who was, excuse me, but thankfully he's been killed, who posted on social media in Russia his own rape of a 3-month-old child. That's so completely disgusting that how do you explain that? You don't. You hate. And it's very difficult to, in an impressionable age of 15 and 17, it's very difficult to, and I mean, we talk a lot. We have to talk a lot. We do. I don't know if that's the way to do it, or I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist by training, but certainly talking to your daughters is an important aspect, I think, of therapy at that point, to make sure that they realize that that no, this is not typical of men. Thankfully, all men are not evil. This particular instantiation of something that is quasi-human is evil. Thankfully, he's no longer among us. I don't know if I'm explaining this properly. I have no idea if it's the right thing to do or not. You play it by ear and wing it, I guess.
Yeah, we saw in the very early days, or at least I did, because I was watching so many different interviews and things, that Russian POWs were initially treated reasonably courteous when they were identifying largely from being from their teachers from the east of Ukraine and random things like that. Has the attitude towards POWs changed a lot since Bucha and Irpin?
Well, there's been rumors of that. I'd like to believe that it hasn't. I'd like to believe that there is a certain amount of righteousness on the Ukrainian side. But I mean, as someone who teaches sociology, I will tell you that hatred and anger will spill over, and particularly when someone has just been trying to kill you, and suddenly you have this person as a prisoner, there is a massive and you know what this person has done in the past. I mean, one of the things that has happened because of technology is that we now know exactly who was in Bucha. And we can track these people through their social media accounts, through their phone numbers, etc. And now that they are being very often captured in eastern Ukraine, we've actually had incidences where we've identified DNA from raped women and from blood samples of prisoners. In other words, we've been able to identify that this particular man was involved in rape in Bucha, and he is now a prisoner. That person is surprisingly still alive. I think that there have been massive amounts of temptation to simply have this person either disappear or be killed. But that person is still alive, and he is a prisoner in Ukrainian hands, which I think says an awful lot for the integrity of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yes.
I'm not sure what I would do in that situation.
No, and I saw a lot of Russians posting their stolen goods home in Belarus before they went on rec leave or whatever it is they got to do when they went back to Belarus.
Yeah, again, that's been stupid on their part, because as soon as they put down an address in the postal system has been hacked multiple times by Ukrainians. By the way, one of the things that Ukrainians are very good at is cybersecurity and hacking. We've got up until the start of the invasion on the 24th, 1/3 of our exports actually came from IT services. So Ukrainians are extremely well known as programmers, and we've used that talent now to gain information about our enemy. And so as soon as they started posting things, they identified themselves, and now that they're being thrown into battle again, we know exactly where they are from their social media accounts, from their phone numbers, and interestingly enough, we now have the ability to actually contact their wives, their sisters, their mothers, people that have been left back home, and very often these people are notified of the death of their sons and husbands sooner by the Ukrainians than they are by the Russian authorities. So when they die in battle, their phones are picked up, and a phone call is made to mom and to say, hey, listen, your son's not coming home. And by the way, he died on foreign territory. He died killing Ukrainians. He died creating atrocities. He died in the process of genocide. maybe that will create some semblance of protest in Russia, because as I said at the start of this conversation, the only way that we're going to end this war is by actually having regime change in Russia. We need to have protest and demonstrations in Russia.
Well, there were a lot at the beginning, but they seem to have suppressed them very well. I haven't seen any for the last few weeks. I don't know if you've seen different.
No, but I mean, at the end of the day, they'll suppress them, but at some point in time, it'll become such a groundswell of people. You know, it's the same type of thing as Vietnam protests. They didn't start immediately. Any kind of anti-war protest takes some time to get going. But my hope is actually for a bit of a palace coup, where the oligarchs around Putin will understand that it's not in their interests to have sanctions, to be sanctioned, and to have their country falling apart. But again, I'm not a Russia expert at this point in time. I'm just trying to help Ukraine survive.
Yes, I really appreciate you sharing your day with me. Thank you very much. I'm sending love to your girls and your son. I'll also send you some links and you can download some English reading material if you like.
Thank you very much for that. Yes.
Do you want to share anything last with your, well, I can't call them fans because that sounds weird, but let's say your avid followers in Australia?
First of all, thank you for following. Thank you for everybody. Thank you to the entire international community, particularly the Ukrainian diaspora, for what you're doing. For anybody that's not Ukrainian, you know, we used to have this joke when I was growing up in Canada. There are two types of people in the world: those that are Ukrainian and those that want to be Ukrainian. That joke has turned out to be a little bit more than a joke lately. Ukrainians are worth fighting for. We're worth helping. This is a war that is not just about Ukraine. It's about values. It's about what's right. And we very much appreciate the help that we've been getting. Keep it up, please. Because without you, the world, without Ukrainians and without your help, Ukrainians will cease to exist. And I think the world will be a worse place for it.
Thank you. I'm sorry, and I'm sending you all my blessings and good wishes. And I'm praying for a speedy end, and I'm shouting about it as much as I can.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Okay, I'm going to stop record and then we'll just wrap up. Thank you.